Welcome to Adding Textures in Photoshop CC by Larry Mathewson. First, we'll start with an image of a horse. This would be the simplest form of texture overlay. Dropped it into Photoshop, and now I'll bring in one of the textures just by clicking and dragging it. You see the size of the texture is larger than the original image, but because I'm dropping it in this way, it creates it as a smart object, and the smart object will size it the same size as the original image. Now if I Control T or click on the image, I can rotate it 90 degrees. I hold the Alt key while pressing the left mouse button. I can size it by maintaining its original aspect. And now I'm going to the file and rasterize it so that I can do some other things to it. I'll select the erase brush, select a soft brush at an opacity of 20%. That's a relative thing that you can make higher or lower. Now I'm going to select the mode of blending between multiply, overlay, or soft light generally. They're the best options I have doing this as an over-the-top texture. I do like the multiply mode best because it's darker. And while in that mode, I'll reduce the opacity to a point that's pleasing, around 77. And now with my brush, holding down the left button, I will stroke over the area where I want to remove some of the texture from the horse. I have to hold that mouse button down so that it removes 20% all at the same point on the horse. Now you'll see on that layer where it's been removed. Since I let go of the brush and I held down again with the left mouse button, I'm taking another 20% off because it was too dark. And that would be my selection. And you can see how the overlay covers the image. I'm going to add a second layer with a different type of overlay. Bring the texture into the document as a separate document. And because it's larger than the original by quite a bit, you'll see when I drag it over, if I drag it over to the original image and drop it on the image, it will drop it with the top left corner. And now I'm going to reduce the size here so that you can see actually how big this texture really is. And just like with the previous one, if I hold down the Alt key, it maintains the aspect ratio. I can reduce it while keeping it on the center of the image. I've just upsized the image so you can see. If I use the Control key and hold down the mouse button, I can drag it at a different aspect ratio, but I want all of the details brought in. So now that I've got it sized to the size of the image, I'm going to select multiply again and set the opacity to the same 77%. So effectively I've doubled up on the texture, and now I'm going to do the same at 20% with a soft brush on this layer. We don't have to be very accurate here, just enough to make it look like what I want to have it look like in the final. Remember, this is all destructive, so if I make a mistake, the only way out of it is using Control Z or Command Z to back up if you're using an Apple. Now that I have what I would say is my final. I'm going to add a blank layer, and I'm going to select all, or Control A, go down to Edit and Stroke, and I'm going to click on the color, which brings up the color picker, go to the image itself, and select the color I think would make a nice stroke on the outside, and then accept it with OK. Now I Control D, or go to Select and Deselect, and now go through the various layer blending modes, and you'll see the outer stroke will change color as we go. And now I'm stopping on screen, which I like. I might reduce the opacity slightly. And at this point, if this was my finished document, I could save it as a PSD, or I could save it as a JPEG and resize. That was the completion of the simplest mode of applying an overlay or texture. And now we'll move on to method 2. I'll select an image, and you'll see the size of it is 3000 by 4000 pixels. I'll drag and drop it into Photoshop. Now we'll go back and drop in a texture by drag and drop again. This one was the same size as the original image. I actually created it that way, so there is no resizing required, but it is still a smart object. I'm going back to the original layer, making a duplicate with dragging it down to the plus sign. If you were going to do it with short keystrokes, it would be Control J or Command J. And now I'm going up to the Select brush, and I'm going to select the subject. In this case, it's very easy because the subject is sitting on a white background. So it's fairly decent selection. You might have to do some refining, but for the most part, it's perfect. Now I'll go back to the layer and Control or Command J makes a new layer with that selection and a blank background, which I'm going to drag above my texture. So the texture is now underneath the selected image. That's the alternate to the previous method. Now I'm going to select the mode for the image itself, the selected image, so that it matches the background, and lighten or darken it based on opacity, and change the selection of the blending mode so it looks like it's either black and white or color, and it looks like it's behind the rain-swept window. Once we've selected the blend mode that most pleases you, I think in this case the overlay, I could either say that's finished and do various other filters, or I can go back and grab another texture. In this case, it's a colored texture, the same type as black and white, and it'll overlay. So I want to drag the image above this texture layer again and go through the same routine as I did before, where I select opacity and the type of overlay so that it meets my criteria for look and feel. Now that I've got this layer, I'm going to add adjustment, and it's the curves adjustment, and I'm going to clip it to the layer with Alt click, and you'll see the little arrow that clipped it to the texture below, And now I'm adjusting with an S curve the darks and the lights. And it's again a personal adjustment just to show you how many different things you can do with textures. Once I've got that set the way I want it to, I may go back to the original and adjust its opacity to make it better fit the newly adjusted underlayer. So let's move on to method number 3. First, I'll drop in my black and white lighthouse. Then I'll go over to the layer and duplicate it with Control or Command J. And once I have that layer duplicated, I'm now going to go to the selection key or brush, and I'm going to select the main subject, which is the lighthouse and some of the foliage. I'm just going to make sure that I've got everything that I want selected, clearly selected. Once I'm happy with that selection, with Control or Command J, I'll make a duplicate of it on a transparent layer. Now I'll go over and pick up and drop in a texture on top. The texture in this case is a color texture. Just making sure my background and foreground colors are normal. I'm now going to modify the blend mode to pick one that I really like. It's a matter of personal preference, and I pretty well settle on hard light. Now I will check and duplicate the layer, because I'm going to do some future things like dragging the previously selected subject in between the two textures. Once I'm happy with the placement, I'm now going to go and rasterize the top layer, which was a smart object, so I can remove some of the overlay at 40% and with a soft brush, and just click selectively over the main subject to remove some of the overlaying texture, being careful not to overlap too much because I'm removing 40% each time I click. Once I'm happy with that, I'll go back to the underlying texture just to verify the look and feel. And now I'm going to apply a hue saturation layer and clip it to the underlying texture. I'm going to play around with lightness and saturation and color until I have a good feel for the overall look. This is very much a personal thing and different for each person. By varying saturation, color, and lightness, I'll come up with something that I'm more comfortable with. Now that I'm comfortable with those settings, I'll go to the layer selected on the transparent background and add brightness and contrast. And I will clip it, Alt click, and adjust contrast and brightness to match the texture underneath. Now that I'm happy with all of the adjustments and textures that I've seen and the layout, I go to the top layer and use the keystrokes Shift Control Alt E to produce a stamped layer of all the layers beneath. I'm now going to turn off all the layers except the base layer, and that's the original. And I go to the top, turn that stamped layer on so you can see what it looks like. And I think I still have some adjustments to make here. I'm going to select the Dodge tool at 20%, and I'm going to click around the image as it was saved in the stamped layer to lighten up those areas that I still feel are too dark. And all I'm adjusting here is the stamped layer. Once I'm happy with that overall, I make a transparent layer on top of everything else, and I select everything and I go to Edit, Stroke, and click on the color, and I'm just moving my mouse around the image to find a color that I think would satisfy the outer stroke. And you can see the color picker moving around as I move the mouse on the image. Once I've found something that I like, I'll say OK, and OK to a 20 pixel stroke. Deselect the selection with Control D. And now I'm going down to the various blend modes to see if there's something I might like a little better than normal. And I found what I like. Play around with opacity, and I'm going to save this image as a PSD and rename it Painterly, just so that I have a copy of this file with all of the layers, so I can go back to it at a later date if I wish and modify any of the layers and the textures. Also, at this point, I'm going to delete all of the additional layers, and I'm going to combine the layers, flatten the image, and with keystrokes, Shift Control Alt W, I'm going to save a JPEG. I'm going to have this resized to 1080 pixels, which is the HD maximum for vertical. Export it with the same name as a JPEG to my working folder and save the image. And now I'm done. On to method number 4. Let's load an image. Let's take this red flower in a vase. I'm going to go over to that layer, and I'm going to duplicate the layer with Command or Control J. Now I'm going to go and select a portion of that image, the flowers, from the background. And now make sure that all of the parts that I want to be selected are pretty close to perfect. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect because we're doing a texture overlay. And now, once I've completed that, then I'm going to go back to the layer and I'm going to use Control J or Command J to duplicate that on a blank background. And now go back to the texture layers and grab what you might think is a texture that absolutely does not fit. And you'll see it is very small in comparison to the overall image. But really, I'm just looking for something from that image that I can use and modify. So Control T will allow me to spin it 90 degrees. Hold the Alt key down and the left mouse button to enlarge it to the size of the underlying image. Now I'm going to go to the blending modes and reduce the blend so I can see the image underneath. And although the green is really not going to be used, I'm going to go to luminosity because I really only want the black and white portion. And then I'm going to invert the color by using Control or Command I. And that gives me the alternate colors. And now I'll reblend with soft light and change the opacity until I'm happy. I'm going to duplicate the layer, Control J, then rasterize the layer and flip it horizontally by Control or Command T, then flip it horizontally. That will duplicate the two. Join the two layers together with Control or Command E, and then reset it as a soft light, and perhaps change the opacity again. So at this point I have my texture the way I want it for this particular location. Then I'm going to take the portion of the image that was extracted from the background on the blank, and with Control click on the layer I will select just the portion that I want to erase. This is in fact removing some of the texture on the duplicated texture layer that I created, and you can see to the right that we're now there, and I go to the underlying one and do a Control J, which is selecting just a portion of that image from the texture underlying, and then I invert it with Control I so that it doesn't apply the texture overall to that selected portion. And I can adjust the blend and the opacity so that just a small portion of the texture is applied to the top of the flowers. Now I'm going to drop in another texture on top of that, place it overall on top of the entire image, size it, holding the Alt key, and because I want all of the roses showing, I'm going to modify it by holding the Control key and reducing the size top and bottom until it all fits. Then I'm going to adjust the blend mode to something that is kind of lighter and not overwhelming. I'm going to adjust the opacity now to reduce the overall effect of that layer since it's quite overwhelming. And I'm going to select a blur, a Gaussian blur, to reduce the contrast, and double up on that texture. I'm selecting once again the main object, and down at the bottom selecting a mask, and the mask was the inverse of what I wanted, so with Control I invert the mask, and now I'm controlling the density of the mask to allow some of that texture with the roses to show through and affect the overall image. Now I'm adding a transparent layer and adding a stroke as I've done in previous times and changing it to 20 pixels, and I'm going to select a color from the image to apply as a stroke around the outside. Deselect with Control or Command D, and now go down and check to see if there is a different blend mode that I might like for the stroke around the outside. I'm happy with that, and so my image is just about the way I want it. So with Shift Control Alt E, I'm going to produce a stamped copy of the entire image just with all the layers shown. And now I'll go to the bottom and turn off all the layers except the original, and go back to the top and turn on just the stamped layer. And if I'm happy with the way that looks, there won't be any additional changes. I will go check the size. It's still quite large, and the mode is RGB 8-bit, and I do want to save this as a JPEG, so I'm going to use the keystrokes Shift Control Alt W, which brings up this dialog, and I can change the height to 1080, make it a JPEG, convert it to sRGB, and you see the size of the file is now 477 kilobytes. There are options for sizing here, but I'm just saving 1:1. And I can export this entire image to my working subdirectory or folder. Make sure it's in the right location and save it. It tells me I already have one with that name, so now I'm just going to add something else to differentiate. Add it, call it a final, and that completes the image. I would also save as a PSD if I wanted to preserve all the layer strokes. You can see here where it was saved as a final. So let's get into our final method here and have some fun. I'm actually in this method going to show you a completed image with many texture layers and blending methods, so you can see the process that I used, and all of these texture layers were created from my original images or created as I built the final image. So we start with the original flower in a vase, and I added this image that was taken somewhere on trips, and I just added blur, Gaussian blur, and I hand drew a mask that reflects only the original image through the texture. I liked that, but it wasn't dark enough, so I added a second layer and made it a little bit darker. Same mask was dragged from the layer below, holding the Alt key and dragging the mask up. Then I added a third texture, and this one was not blurred as much. It's using the same hand-drawn mask that I dragged up from the underneath layers, and this leaf that was taken outdoor was just used for its texture. The image then had various textures adjustments to modify its hue, saturation, and levels. And the levels allows me to lighten or darken the original layer, and each of these was clipped to that leaf, that orange yellow leaf below, and I'm only using it for its basic texture. And now that I've shown you a little bit of how I do that, I actually go to the next layer. And this one was totally created as a transparent layer to start with, and brushes. And I just applied multiple colors and strokes, and I used the existing mask by dragging it, holding the Alt key from previous layers, and just modifying the blend mode to soft light. The final layer was also hand drawn with a different brush and similar colors and the same mask. So all of these layers have a mask that's been modified by hand to get what you see here. Now, the fact that I have 4 or 5 layers of texture on top with levels and hue and saturation adjustments allows me to play a little bit. So if I want to look at something different, I added the top layer with a stroke, and I put the stroke just inside the outer edge of the image. And now I can apply blending modes, if I wish, to the image below. I'll go back to normal here, and I will just show you some of the things you can play with as you're building the image. And once you've got it what you think is a final, you can go down through the layers and turn them on and off and see if you like something a little better. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Even changing the levels, changing the hue and saturation. Try them on and off. Turn on and off certain layers to see if it makes any difference. Sometimes you surprise yourself, and what you originally started with turned out not to be your final. Now I got to turn all these texture layers back on, because this is what I decided I liked the best. Now I'm going to the top, and I'm going to create a stamped layer. A couple final adjustments here. Some of these hand-drawn layers, the colors were too vibrant, so I'm reducing the opacity to soften it up somewhat. And in this layer I used an inverted color, so Control I to change the color palette, and then reevaluate my blend mode to see if it's something I like other than normal. But we'll go back to normal here and just play with opacity. So it's a little softer with the alternate colors. And to show you just how little that mask affects that. Now I'm going to create with Shift Control Alt E a stamped layer. I'll turn off all the layers and then go up to the top and turn on the stamped layer. This is the final version. I would save this in its entirety as a PSD file so that I maintain all of the current layers, but the file is quite large. So in this case I use Shift Control Alt W, which brings up this dialog and allows me to save a JPEG at 1080 pixels, and the size of the file is 441 kilobytes, and sRGB color profile. And now I export it back to my working subdirectory alongside my original, and we'll just change the name to call it Final. And that would be it. I would actually have the PSD version and the final version saved as a JPEG. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, press the subscribe button for future videos and smash that bell, as well as giving me a thumbs up.